Ladies and gentlemen, my friends, fellow human beings from across the world, it truly is a privilege for me to be in communication with you for the fabric of righteousness. I am Nikhil Parekh. By God's astoundingly invincible grace upon me, I am a 10-time national record holder with the Limca Book of Records India, which is ranked second officially in the world to the Guinness Book of World Records. It truly is God's invincibly spectacular grace upon me that I could achieve 10 national records for my poetry with the Limca Book of Records India. In this video, I shall be speaking about my book titled One God, Poems on God Creator, Volume 1, as well as giving you a recitation of different poems from this book. So, let me commence with an introduction to my book titled One God, Poems on God Creator, Volume 1. You can of course purchase this book of mine from Amazon.com. This book, which has 50 differently titled poems, is actually volume 1 of the book titled One God, Poems on God Creator, 522 pages. A profound dedication, a ramification of the innumerable omnipotent fragrances of life that I have smelt by the grace of God. I am grateful to Him for enlightening me about His chapters of invincible creation and considering me worthy enough to describe His unparalleled splendor in a few words and in the shape of this book. A salient tribute to His undefeated power. Prologue. The compilation of poems depicts the omniscient Creator in His infinite, unconquerable shapes and forms. Goes to irrefutably prove that there is just one Creator. You choose to call Him by whatever name, and for every one of us, till the time we live. This book is a perpetual dedication to Almighty Lord. It quintessentially portrays the splendor of the Almighty Creator in His infinite forms. Goes to victoriously prove at every step that no matter how hard the devil tries to annihilate the planet, an inconspicuous tap of the Lord's finger makes him crumble to his very last non-existent frigid roots. About the book. Poems depicting the omnipotent glory of the Creator in an infinite forms that the poet could ever perceive. Poems depicting the omnipotent glory of the Creator in an infinite forms that the poet could ever conceive, natural and uninhibited outpourings of the heart. These poems transport the reader into a world of spirituality and magnificence of Godhead. Every poetic piece shows Parekh's unparalleled love for the Almighty and immortalizes the omnipresent aura of the Lord in a boundless ways and shapes. This spiritually enriched compendium of poems is for all those who have timelessly admired the miraculous prowesses and powers of God at each stage of their lives. Those who have lived each instant of their lives worshipping His omniscient grace, irrespective of the most murderous hell descending around. The poetic imagery brilliantly transcends over every inhibition of caste, creed, color, and religion, and goes to perpetually prove that all living beings are one and blessed. That all living beings are one and blessed. In his fathomless sacrosanct light of truth, the poems depict Parekh's oneness in mind, body, and spirit with the Creator. So now I will begin the recitation of different poems from this book. Of course, at any juncture, you can purchase this book of mine from Amazon.com. Here is a poem titled God Himself from this book of mine. God Himself. He whom you can explicitly see is not God, and He who was the strongest, without the most minuscule form, appearing even in flaming sunlight, was not one of God's infinite disciples, but God Himself. He whom you can profoundly feel is not God, and He who was entirely ungraspable, without even leaving an untidy footprint, after majestically traversing on soil, was not one of God's infinite disciples, but God Himself. He whom you can magnificently create is not God, and He who exists in an incomprehensibly fathomless myriads of forms was not one of God's infinite disciples, but God Himself. He whom you can profusely imagine is not God, and He who remains perpetually obscure even after floating in each particle of the exotic atmosphere was not one of God's infinite disciples, but God Himself. He whom you can vividly dream about is not God, and He who propelled every brain to think beyond corridors of the unbelievably extraordinary was not one of God's infinite disciples, but God Himself. He whom you can coin your destiny with is not God, and He who was maneuvering the lives of boundless at the mere tip of His little finger was not one of God's infinite disciples, but God Himself. He whom you can cremate is not God. He whom you can cremate is not God, and He who was immortally living since unprecedented centuries ago, even before this earth was created, was not one of God's infinite disciples, but God Himself. He whom you can admire is not God, and He who was bestowing an everlasting labyrinth of beauty every unfolding second was not one of God's infinite disciples, but God Himself. He whom you can wholeheartedly cry for is not God. He whom you can wholeheartedly cry for is not God. And He who was incessantly replacing tears of all mankind with omnipresent smiles was not one of God's infinite disciples, but God Himself. He whom you can bid a celestial adieu is not God, and He who was spawning countless for every entity withering was not one of God's infinite disciples, but God Himself. He whom you can fabulously describe is not God. And he who was all omniscient, having already embodied the scriptures of holy tomorrow, even before the world had begun, was not one of God's infinite disciples, but God Himself. He whom you can devotedly chant till times beyond eternity is not God. He whom you can devotedly chant till times beyond eternity is not God. And he who irrefutably steered every lip on this globe to propagate the essence of benevolent existence was not one of God's infinite disciples, but God Himself. He whom you can belligerently fight for is not God. And he who evolved the most marvelously wonderful species of creation, called man, was not one of God's infinite disciples, but God Himself. He whom you can perpetually keep close to your chest was not God. He whom you perpetually kept close to your chest was not God. And he who made every single heart throb for the person it loved was not one of God's infinite disciples, but God Himself. He whom you witnessed blossoming was not God. And he who stood taller than the sun to illuminate every miserably darkened cranny of trembling soil was not one of God's infinite disciples, but God Himself. He whom you witnessed blossoming was not God. And he who stood taller than the sun to illuminate every miserably darkened cranny of trembling soil was not one of God's infinite disciples, but God Himself. God Himself. So here is another different poem from this book of mine. This poem is titled Allah. So here is a recitation of my poem titled Allah. He was the one who maneuvered my tongue, bestowed upon me the ability to eloquently speak. He was the one who made me smile, emphatically displaying my armory of white teeth to the world. He was the one who produced empathy in my eyes, made them profoundly glisten in the morning light. He was the one who made me rambunctiously chatter, bounce in the true fervor of life. He was the one who made me sneeze, burst into infinite chortles of uninhibited laughter. He was the one who engendered me to sweat, tremble innocuously with infinite goosebumps creeping up inadvertently on my naked skin. He was the one who made me dream, fantasize to the most bizarre limits of contemplation. He was the one who enabled me to traverse on earth, put my feet firmly on the black soil I tread. He was the one who made me blush a perfect crimson as I inevitably winked at a mesmerizing girl. He was the one who imparted me the skill to voraciously read, pen down intricate lines of exquisite calligraphy. He was the one who impregnated awesome strength in my knuckles, granted them the tenacity to defend the infirm. He was the one who made me decipher the minutest of noise. Wholesomely relish the blend of tingling sounds and atmosphere. He was the one who filled my stomach whenever I felt famished, ensured that the right morsels of food occupied its cavities. He was the one who embodied in me the exuberance to run, inhaling gallons of revitalizing air into my lungs. He was the one who taught me to judiciously discern between the good and bad, curtail myself from indulging into the nefarious and licentious. He was the one who evaded all circumspection from my mind whenever I felt besieged by a host of inexplicable dilemmas. He was the one who instilled astronomical courage in my demeanor, made me stand tall and unflinching against all barricades that confronted me in my way. He was the one who made me nostalgic. Reminisce profoundly the poignant memories of my childhood in my mother's lap. He was the one who found me the love of my life, made sure that it consolidated into sacrosanct marriage. He was the one who resurrected my faith in life every unfurling minute, made me imbibe the true spirit of existence. He was the one who was the blood flowing through my veins, the beating of my heart as it throbbed violently in my chest. He was the one who was the blood flowing through my veins, the beating of my heart as it throbbed violently in my chest. And he was the one whom people of varied races christened as God, Christ, Bhagwan, Creator, Almighty, Lord, whom I fondly referred today until the time I existed as my Allah. And he was the one whom people of varied races christened as God, Christ, Bhagwan, Creator, Almighty, Lord, whom I fondly referred today until the time I existed as my Allah. So here I'll be giving a recitation of another different poem from this book of mine. This poem is titled as One God. So here it is, a recitation of my poem titled One God. There were several colors in this world. Some were as black as the hideous reptile, while some were pearly and sparkling white. There were several tunes in this world. Some were as sweet as the nightingale, while some were as hoarse and discordant as the horse. There were several seasons in this world. Some were as hot as the blistering sun, while some were as placid reflections of the serene night. There were several seasons in this world. Some were as hot as the blistering sun, while some were placid reflections of the serene night. There were several hair in this world. Some were as fiery as flamboyant flames of the fire, while some were honey and golden brown. There were several fishes in this world. Some were as tiny as shells, while some were monstrously huge as the shark. There were several dwellings in this world. There were several dwellings in this world. Some were as fortified as raw iron, while some were languidly drooping down like the pigeon feather. There were several eyes in this world. Some were sizzling incessantly in unseething passion, while some were as uncouth as dry ice. There were several cars in this world. Some were as swanky as the dungeon full of diamonds, while some had no engine at all. There were several entities in this world. Some were as pretentious as the peacock, while some slept timidly like black mice. There were several cheeks in this world. Some had boundless tufts of black beard, while some were as effeminate as the queen's garden. There were several waters in this world, some swirling as turbulently as the ocean, while some flowed like molten butter melting down. There were several smiles in this world. Some were as spurious as the cunningly astute businessman, while some were humanitarian and ready to assist, at all times. There were several perfumes in this world. Some were as mesmerizing to inhale as the scarlet rose, while some caused you to vomit out the food you had consumed for morning breakfast. There were several roads in this world. Some were blissful carpets of satin to transgress upon, while some were embedded profusely with acrid thorns. There were several dreams in this world. Some were as ghastly as savage massacre. While some were as exotic as heavenly paradise. There were several clothes in this world. Some were as gaudy as the resplendent rainbow, while some were rustically entwined roots. There were several religions in this world. Some believed in burying man after his death. While some charred him to raw ash after he left breath. There were several languages in this world. Some were as primordial as mystical Sanskrit, while some were contemporary and Oriental English. There were several bodies in this world. Some were as tall as the lanky tree, while some hardly grew above the kitchen sink. And there were several forms of Almighty Lord. Some were called Christ, some Allah, some Buddha, some Bhagwan. And there were several forms of Almighty Lord. Some were called Christ, some Allah, some Buddha, some Bhagwan. But from centuries unprecedented, since the time this earth of ours evolved, and even before, there has been just one creator, just one God. but from centuries unprecedented since the time this earth of ours evolved, and even before, there has been just one creator. There has been just one creator, just one God, just one God. Here is a poem titled He Was Every Person's Creator from this book of mine. So I will be giving a recitation of this poem as well. So here it is, a recitation of my poem titled He Was Every Person's Creator. For every bird gruesomely killed, he had the power to create infinite more fledglings. For every river dried miserably to a trickle, he had the power to create infinite oceans. For every tree brutally chopped to the ground, he had the power to create infinite forests. For every eye inadvertently blinded, he had the power to create infinite with sight. For every satanic night taking a complete stranglehold on light, he had the power to create infinite brilliant days. For every tongue which was disdainfully dumb, he had the power to create infinite mouths which could speak and shout. For every iota of currency furtively stolen, he had the power to create infinite banks looming high and handsome till the heavens. For every couple who was childless and rendered cruelly unable to procreate, he had the power to create infinite more households bustling with a battalion of toddlers. For every brain that was wholesomely exhausted, he had the power to create infinite intelligent minds. For every child disastrously orphaned on the streets, he had the power to create infinite families complete in all respects. For every blade of grass mercilessly trampled, he had the power to create infinite meadows of lush green crop. For every skeleton lying disdainfully buried under the coffin, he had the power to create infinite bodies dancing about in robust health and thunderous fervor. For every scalp that was bolder than the egg, for every scalp that was bolder than the egg, he had the power to create infinite strands of shimmering hair. For every life lost unwittingly during the tumultuous earthquake, he had the power to create infinite more souls as kings. For every slave bound wretchedly to gleaming chains, he had the power to create infinite crusaders to break open the shackles. For every throat that was dangerously thirsty, he had the power to create infinite mouths slavering with excess water. For every watch that had abruptly relinquished to function, he had the power to create infinite clocks ticking at electric speeds. For every albino engulfed entirely with a coat of appalling pink skin, For every albino engulfed entirely with a coat of appalling pink skin, he had the power to create infinite beauties with the most charismatic of flesh. For every house that had been diabolically pulverized, to raw dust during war, he had the power to create infinite palaces blended profusely with glittering gold and silver. For every demon wandering at will on this earth, he had the power to create infinite angels to valiantly defend the world. For every heart pathetically broken, he had the power to create and bind infinite having just taken birth. For every heart pathetically broken, he had the power to create and bind infinite having just taken birth. His power to create was simply unprecedented. His process of evolution was simply boundless and beyond the most unimaginable degree of comprehension. And that is why he was not only mine, but every person's almighty creator. His power to create was simply unprecedented. His process of evolution was simply boundless and beyond the most unimaginable degree of comprehension. And that is why he was not only mine, but every person's almighty creator. And that is why he was not only mine, but every person's almighty creator. So, ladies and gentlemen, it truly was a privilege for me to have read from my book One God, Poems on God Creator Volume 1, and having given you a recitation of different poems from this book. I, from the innermost dormitory of my soul, hope that you have liked this video. Thank you so much for listening to me.